Hey, welcome back. Today I am talking about The Winter's Tale by Shakespeare. And I've got a snow day. We had an ice storm, and I'm probably going to be locked in my house for a while. So, what a great time to make a video. So, The Winter's Tale is one of the irregular Shakespeares. It falls into the category of romance, which is not an original category to Shakespeare classification, but one that scholars developed over time. Along with Pericles and Cymbeline and The Tempest, it fits one of those stories that's all about family disruption and tragedy, but it ultimately ends with a possibility of redemption. There's a fairy tale-like quality to the ending of these stories, and that's definitely true of The Winter's Tale. The idea of redemption is very, very important to the end of The Winter's Tale, because Leontes, who is a terrible guy in the first half, suffers horribly and terrible loss because of his outrageous sins. And yet, he's offered a second chance and offered an opportunity to recover in the end. But it's not a recovery that's without sorrow and grief. And in fact, not all things are recoverable. And so it isn't just a cheerful, everything's fixed, everything's great and rosy comedy. And it's not an out-and-out destructive tragedy either. But something in the middle. There's also a lot of fun themes running through this. First of all, we have the very interesting structure. Acts 1 through 3 are very associated with winter imagery. It's full of mistakes and tragedy and coldness and destruction and death. But halfway through the play, as Act 4 begins, there's a clear shift in tone and in feeling to the overall play. Suddenly, we enter into a time of summer and life. And we shift from a family that has been destroyed by jealousy and move to a pair of young lovers. There's a lot of singing and dancing and festivity in the second half. It's interesting because right at the end of Act 3, one of the characters finds a lost child, while another sees a man be killed. And there's this sense that we've shifted from death to new life at that point. The shepherd who finds the baby says, "Thou metst with things dying, I with things newborn," showing the transition from the cold death of the first 3 acts with the life and newness of the next 2. Also, there's a discussion all the way through the play of the tension between nature and art, things that are created and things that come from the natural world. There's a lot of characters who create themselves, putting on disguises and coming up with new personalities. And there are also pieces of art that feature very significantly, especially the statue at the end. And in nature, there's a lot about the idea of being the issue, the offspring of someone. The whole problem of the play stems from Leontes' jealousy of his wife, thinking that their child is illegitimate. Something that issues from you is something that is from your nature, but is also something that perhaps you create. And so there's a lot of playfulness between the idea of creating in an artistic way and creating in a natural way. A tension that Shakespeare plays up with all kinds of fun little ironies. Finally, there's a fantastic motif of clasping hands. Characters throughout the play are clasping each other's hands. And we think of hand clasping as a sign of friendship. And there are some significant friendships within this play, but there are also characters who betray each other. The idea of treachery and betrayal shows up over and over again. Leontes, in his rage, betrays both his best friend and his wife. And he justifies this by saying that they betrayed him first, although it's all in his head. And in a story all about families and friends that are severed and torn apart, and reunited and joined back together, the image of the clasped hand is very significant. Alright, before I jump into the content of this play, let's talk about the title, The Winter's Tale. Although the story doesn't specifically talk about winter much, there is a reference to a winter's tale within the story. In Act 2, Hermione is speaking with her son, Mamilius. He's a young boy and he's been hanging around with his mother and all of her maids, and they decide to tell each other stories. And although his mother suggests they tell merry stories, the young boy Mamilius says that a winter's tale is better for a tale of grief and sorrow. Full of sprites and goblins, he says. He proceeds to tell her a story, but they do it in whispers over on the side of the stage. We don't actually hear the story. And so, as this becomes the title of the overall play, we see that this is a story of sorrow and grief. It's also a story not of fairy sprites and goblins, but the goblin of Leontes' jealousy. And yes, there is sort of a fairy tale resolution to it, in that the ending becomes kind of magical in the way that it reunites and resolves the issues. Although notably and tragically, even the fairy tale resolution can't bring all back from the dead. There's still loss, there's still grief, including this young boy who wanted to tell the sad story. And so we begin with a story of two kings, Polixenese and Leontes, who were friends for their whole lives. Polixenese is the king of Bohemia, and Leontes is the king of Sicilia. And Polixenese has come for a long visit. However, it's the end of his visit, it's time for him to go home, and Leontes is trying to encourage him to stay a little longer. When he fails to persuade him, he asks his wife, Hermione, to try to persuade Polixenese further. She uses lots of wordplay and clever argumentation to get him to agree to stay for another few weeks. A happy resolution to Leontes' request. However, Leontes, as he's watching his wife argue with Polixenese and encourage him to stay, becomes very, very jealous. He wonders why she was able to win him over when he didn't. Could be just that her arguments were better. Also, that it's harder to offend the hostess. As he watches Polixenese and Hermione together, he becomes more and more jealous, though. The way she acts with so much love towards him. Of course, it's love that he encouraged. The love of a dear friend and a wife. He also looks at his son, who again and again has been attributed with wonderful praise, and as looking exactly like his father. And he begins to, in his intense jealousy, wonder if his son is really his own. Hermione is also pregnant at this point, and he begins to wonder whether Polixenese is the father. As Hermione is casually talking about their childhoods, wondering what these two friends were like as children, Leontes talks about how they were so innocent, and it was only when they first became married and got to know women that they were introduced to treachery and evil. And Hermione kind of laughs that off. After all, I corrupted you? What are you talking about? She is played throughout this entire story as good can be. Incredibly noble, incredibly clear-headed, and gentle. She's also the one who is logical, not driven to passion like Leontes. But he's developing this sort of misogynistic angst against her, feeling like, women are corruptors, and so my wife must be seducing Polixenese. He has no evidence for it whatsoever, except for the fact that she's acting friendly, because he asked her to. As he's watching this, he starts to talk to Camillo, and he asks for clarification, why is Polixenese staying longer? And Camillo's like, because, you all asked, Hermione asked. And Leontes is like, you see it too, she's obviously, in a relationship with Polixenese. And Camilla's like, no, she's so perfect, she's a fantastic wife, she's pure, she's wonderful. But Leontes now sees that as confirmation, and he becomes so enraged with his completely unsubstantiated idea that he asks Camillo to go ahead and murder Polixenese. Camillo's like, And when Leontes leaves, Camillo goes and confesses all of this to Polixenese and is like, dude, Leontes is going a little nuts over you. He's really enraged. There's no way you can talk him down because he's acting crazy, so you better leave. And because I told you, now I'm going to have to flee too. So Camillo and Polixenese sneak off and flee. What does that bode for Hermione? Nothing good. Act 2 begins with Hermione talking with Mamilius, as I've already mentioned, telling each other stories. And as we have this sweet domestic scene with these caring and wonderful people, in storms Leontes, enraged because he sees Polixenese escaped him. And he sees that as further confirmation that it was all true, and now he's absolutely sure. So he completely lambasts Hermione in front of everyone, publicly accusing her of adultery, and even of plotting to kill him. Act 2, Scene 1 has this fantastic juxtaposition between his rage and absolutely unsubstantiated claims and Hermione's cool-headedness in response to this. Yes, she's emotionally devastated by all of this, but yet she's still very clear, very calm, and responds to all of this with a kind of nobility that completely belies the guilt that he sees in her. Everyone tries to talk him down. All the people who are closest to him and who love him most try to talk him down from this. Try to at least, get some better proof other than your own guess here. And the more they try to talk him down, the more Leontes rages about it. And we can see as the play continues forward, he's going to continue to build and build and build and rage, and it becomes more and more true in his mind, even though it's not actually true. But he does at least send to Delphos to get proof from the Oracle of Apollo, to see what the gods have to say on the matter. Of course, he's already come to his conclusion before any of this happens. Paulina, who is a very important lady of the court, the wife of Antigonus, who is a very important lord that we'll see continuing on, one of the ones who's trying to talk Leontes down, goes to try to speak with Hermione, but she's not allowed into the jail. She's only allowed to see one of the maidservants, Emilia. And she finds out that Hermione, in her distress, went into labor and gave birth to a baby daughter. Paulina, who is very hard-headed and outspoken, decides that maybe the sight of this innocent child will be enough to move Leontes to change his tune, or at least show some mercy and try to figure this thing out. And so she takes the baby to go to the king. We see Leontes has gone even further at this point. He is so enraged that he feels like he will not be able to rest until his wife is dead. There's a real fear of his wife and his lack of control over her at this point, as though the act of giving birth is something that he can't control in her. There's no way he can tell if it's his own child, and so he just wants her dead. Paulina intrudes, and although the other counselors and lords try to stop her because they know he's not going to take it well, including her own husband, Antigonus, she steps up and shows the babe and tells her mind. Leontes, rather than being moved by the baby, is enraged and calls the baby illegitimate. He also yells at Antigonus for not being able to keep his wife in check. And after a verbal sparring match back and forth with her, she leaves with the baby there lying in front of him. Instead of taking the child up, he tells Antigonus to go burn the baby, although he backs down a little bit and says, no, this baby came by a strange means, we'll let it live by strange means, we'll let it, give it a strange kind of punishment, we'll go drop it somewhere out where it can maybe survive, expose the baby on a hill somewhere, and see if it can survive wolves and bears. As Act 2 closes, we hear word that the Oracle message has returned, and it's time to find out what the Oracle had to say. Act 3 opens with the two members of the court who went to the Oracle talking about the peace and majesty of the Oracle in strong contrast to the rage and illogic, irrational fear that we see in Leontes' court. Act 3 continues with the trial, and the trial is basically a farce. Leontes calls his wife in and has her stand up in front of everyone, even though she's just given birth and clearly needs to be in bed. She doesn't complain about that until the end of the scene, when she's making her final response to everything in this amazing and impassioned speech. But Leontes accuses her, assuming that it's already true, and that nothing can show otherwise, even though everything she says is calm and reasonable and clearly argued. whereas his are all insubstantiated and irrational. When he finally threatens to kill her, she makes this wonderful speech. There's a fantastic YouTuber named Shakespeare with Sarah, and she does a great job of unpacking monologues for actors. And she has a wonderful exploration of this scene. So I'm going to go ahead and put a link to it here as well as in the comments, and you should definitely watch that and see how she unpacks this. But I'll go ahead and read it. Sir, spare your threats. The bug which you would fright me with, I seek. To me can life be no commodity. The crown and comfort of my life, your favor I do give lost, for I do feel it gone, but know not how it went. My second joy, the first fruits of my body, from his presence I am barred, like one infectious. My third comfort, starred most unluckily, is from my breast the innocent milk in its most innocent mouth, hauled out to murder. Myself on every post proclaimed a strumpet, with immodest hatred the childbed privilege denied, which longs to women of all fashion, lastly hurried here, to this place, in the open air, before I have got strength of limit. Now, my liege, tell me what blessing I have here alive, that I should fear to die. Therefore proceed. But yet hear this, mistake me not. No life, I price it not a straw, but for mine honour, which I would free, if I shall be condemned upon surmises, all proof sleeping else, but what your jealousies awake, I tell you 'tis rigour, and not law. Your honours all, I do refer me to the oracle. Apollo be my judge. She doesn't care about her life at all. She only cares about, first of all, her love that she had for him. She cares about the love that she had for her children, one of whom she is imprisoned away from, the other who was ripped from her and exposed to die, for no fault except for his wild surmises. And so she calls upon the gods to prove her honor correct. It's the last thing that she has that she's holding on to. And the message comes in from Apollo and says, yup, Hermione's right. Leontes is a tyrant, and his innocent babe truly begotten, and the king shall live without an heir, if that which is lost be not found. And so we get this prophecy, which is going to be important for the rest of the story. Something is lost that needs to be found before we can have a resolution. We find out what that is in the very next scene. But Leontes is not even willing to listen to the gods at this point. His rage has blinded him so much that he says, bah, that's false too. It's a lie too, like everything else. At that moment, disaster strikes and destroys Leontes' life. A messenger runs in to tell him that his son, who is so well loved and so good and so pure and so wonderful and so much a mirror of his father in his features, has died out of fear for his mother. The queen is overtaken by grief and taken off, and a moment later Paulina runs in and says, the queen's died now. Great job, Leontes. And Leontes suddenly discovers, a moment too late, how disastrous his jealousy and his crazy, illogical paranoia really are. But it's too late. He's lost his wife and both of his children, and now he is heirless and completely without his family. In the last scene of Act 3, we shift to Bohemia, where Antigonus has taken the child. He took the child in his arms and sailed to Bohemia. He had this wild dream of Hermione coming to him, and in this vision he saw that he would never return home thanks to his participation in this. Even though he feels great pity for this child, and even though he hates what he's doing, he did participate, and he will never be able to go home to Paulina again. The sky is getting darker and darker, and so he leaves the child with a bag of gold and a message, hoping that the child will be okay somewhere in here. And he leaves her with the name that Hermione in the dream gave him. That name is Perdita, the Lost. And as he steps away from the child, a bear chases after him and eats him. Shakespeare's most famous stage direction, exit pursued by a bear. And so the curse comes upon him, and he becomes part of that sacrifice. Leontes destroys everyone around him, not just his entire family, but also all the people who tried to talk him down. All those people who cared about him and stood by him. Camillo is exiled and loses his home. Antigonus is horribly devoured. At this point, an old shepherd enters, and he finds the babe. He's been looking for his sheep, and there's this baby girl. He's so surprised and overwhelmed by this and wonders where she came from. In comes his son a moment later, who has just seen a horrible shipwreck. That ship that brought Antigonus here just went down in a horrible storm. And he also saw Antigonus being devoured by the bear. And so we have the last great tragedies and death of the first 3 acts, as well as the new life that's being picked up with Perdita in Bohemia. And now it's time for a change of scenery. And so I'm going to go inside because I am so cold.